Okay, so to conclude our discussion on GDP or gross domestic product, I wanted to show you a couple pictures, right, to kind of drive home. I mean, it's one thing to kind of look at a video and write on the board and talk about gross domestic product and consumer spending and all that kind of stuff, but a picture is worth a thousand words, right? So I have a couple of pictures here I want to show you. This is just a picture of Adam Smith because I didn't want you staring at a blank screen. To really understand the impact of the U.S. economy and to really, one way of sort of understanding just how powerful our economy is and make, you need to understand that we have the largest economy on the face of the planet, bar none, period, dot. And this first picture kind of drives that home. I love this picture because when you think of the United States, you can't economically, we're not like one country, we're like 50 countries. And in fact, each one of our states has the economic GDP of an entire country, right? Like, take for instance, Texas. Texas alone has the GDP or economic might of Canada. California by itself has the economic or GDP might of the United Kingdom. So this is a more accurate way to understand output and what is produced in the United States, and the economic kind of a superiority that we enjoy. It kind of makes me laugh because if you look at Georgia, right? Georgia has the same economic might as Sweden. And I always think, whenever I read or somebody says, well, the U.S. should be like Sweden, that's kind of like saying the U.S., the entire U.S. should be just like Georgia. And again, what works on a micro scale doesn't always work at the macro scale. So just because something works in, say Sweden or Georgia or something like that, doesn't mean, our country is so vast, so diverse, and it doesn't necessarily work that way. So I like this picture, okay? Now, the second picture is going to be a little bit more complex. I'm going back to Fred, my favorite tool of all time. And I want to do a little comparing and contrasting. So obviously I've sort of written down these codes beforehand, but let's see if we can understand GDP pictorially, right? I gave you the equation. GDP equals, consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending, and then the foreign sector, exports and imports, and all of that is sort of reconciled. But what's it look like? Well, let's see. If I put in this code, there it is, consumption spending. It's going to give me a graph. And, again, I can use the hover feature. And so you can see those gray bars are periods of recession. This big thick one was the 2008 financial crisis. And then the skinny one right here is the COVID. And you can see how much consumption dropped off when everything shut down for COVID. I can kind of pull the scale in a little bit so we don't have to go all the way back to the 50s. But let's do it right about there, 80s, right? This is when I went to high school, so I'm comfortable with that. But you can see, so second quarter 2021, that what this says is 13 trillion, almost $14 trillion worth of consumption spending by households. Okay, so, well, what does that mean? I mean, is that a lot? Is that, how does that compare to the government and all of that? So let's see. Let's see what firms spent money on, okay? So if I look at firm spending, there's private domestic investment. And you can see spending by firms is way, 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 way less than consumption spending. So consumption spending, again, is running 13 and a half, almost 14 trillion. Investment spending by business, only about 3.5 trillion. What about government? Well, what do you think? I'm typing in the code, but what would you think? You think it's equal to or greater than either consumption spending or investment spending? Let's see. There you go. It's almost identical to the level of consumption spending. So again, there we are in the second quarter 2021, which is pretty much where we are right now. Firms are spending about 3.5 trillion. Government spending just slightly less at 3 trillion. I mean, and this makes sense, right? The budget over the past several years for the government, COVID notwithstanding, has been about $4 trillion for the entire, fiscal year. Right now, with COVID, they've introduced a series of measures to spend more, and that's being reflected in this number. But even with that, look at how much difference there is between consumption spending and government spending and investment spending. Now, let's add in and look at the foreign sector. Okay, so if I type in the exports, there we go. There's exports. Now, here's what I have to do, though. I have to account for the imports and subtract out the imports. So let me add that code in. And then what I'm doing here is, there we go. So we can see the foreign sector, right? The foreign sector is below that bold line. Well, that bold line is 0. So because the foreign sector is below that, it's a negative number. And we talked about that, right? Because in the U.S., our imports exceed our exports. And so that will be a negative number. But here's the deal. So all of these graphs are sort of superimposed. But let me change the format so we can kind of rack and stack them all together. And stacking normal. And there you go. This is a really good way of looking at and understanding gross domestic product. You can see that, this is 20 trillion, and we produce almost $20 trillion annually in gross domestic product. And these are the 4 sectors that contribute. So consumption spending, so this really adds up to just less than 20, so 19 something, but right. So 13.5 trillion from consumers, about 3.5 from business, about 3.4, from government, and then of course a negative from the foreign sector. And this is what GDP looks like in the U.S. economy. So I hope that's helpful. And I just noticed that all the codes and things that I used over here didn't get put on the video. So leave a comment if you want to know the codes and stuff like that. Maybe I'll put those in the comment section if you want to kind of recreate this graph on your own. But actually, as you go through and watch the video, if it's interesting to you, then leave a comment and I'll leave the codes.